regularly teach a course at NC State every fall. It's called English 364, Film History to 1940. In this course, I basically do what I'm going to do for you in the next few minutes over the course of half a semester. So this is going to be quite condensed, but it's important to know. So the first thing is that motion pictures were invented in the 1890s. So before the 1890s, nobody had ever made or seen a movie. Okay? But very early in the birth and evolution of the medium, it became clear that film had a pretty extraordinary capacity to do three things. The first was to document. So the first films were called actualities, and these would have been films of, say, a train pulling into a station or a parade or a ship pulling into a harbor. So documenting things happening in the real world. The second trajectory was to entertain. So the very first films were 15 to 20 seconds long, and these might have been short skits that made people laugh. But as films got longer, they became story films that had characters, had plots, and they were made so that people would be entertained. And the third was to educate. And I'm gonna kind of ultra simplify this, but you've probably been told before that showing is better than telling. And so many people felt that film could show people things that they could learn better than telling them things. So these were not mutually exclusive categories either. You could make a film that was documentary, that was also entertaining, and that was also educating at the same time. So for the rest of our session, we're going to be talking about a pair of American films from the 19-teens. And in the first instance, we're going to think about how infectious disease could be used in the service of entertainment. May seem like a strange idea, but really common. The second thing we'll be talking about is how film could be mobilized to provide the public with vital health information. Today we would call this science communication, not a term that was used in the 19-teens, but it's what we'll be talking about today. So first, a few things about tuberculosis, about which you may not know much. Tuberculosis is a disease of the lungs, also called TB, also called consumption. And in the early 1900s, tuberculosis killed 1 out of every 7 people in the United States and Europe. I'm going to say that again, 1 out of every 7. So at the time of the films that we'll be talking about today, TB was the leading cause of death in the United States. So this was a huge public health problem. There are copious examples of tuberculosis or consumption in literature. I will mention only a few of the most famous examples. One would be the Alexander Dumas novel Camille, another would be Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. But many, many novels and plays had tuberculosis and consumption in them to reflect the fact that this was happening in the real world, and many authors suffered from consumption as well. So when you look at movies, especially from the pre-1940s, and you see someone coughing on screen, it is almost always a signal of consumption. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because on a set, things are very controlled. No director would let an actor cough accidentally and leave it in a film, right? So anytime there's a cough, it's a signal of disease. And most often in this period of time, it would have been consumption. So TB is unlike COVID in most ways. For example, tuberculosis is much harder to catch. You really need a prolonged exposure. But there are similarities in terms of the primary way that it is spread, which is through the air, coughing and sneezing in particular. And so tuberculosis was especially rampant in closed and crowded factories and in urban tenement housing, which was very common in places like New York City, where there was a large immigrant working poor population housed in substandard conditions, usually in very cramped quarters. Now, the other thing to know about tuberculosis is that there was no cure for it until the 1940s, besides going to a place called a sanatorium, where you would basically rest, take fresh air and sunshine, and try to allow the lungs to heal themselves. In other words, there was no real cure. And it really wasn't until even the late 19th century that scientists began to understand how TB was spread, through the air, through sputum or spit. And at that point in time, they had to mount a public health campaign to teach people about how to avoid contracting it, which is what brings us to the films today. But let's start with the entertainment film. Now, it may seem a little odd, but disease was a popular subject or plot device in early storytelling films. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Dramatic stories need tension. You have to have a problem or an obstacle to overcome in order to tell a good story. And disease is a pretty easy one, right? It comes up, it has to be cured, someone either lives or dies, and so it's a very easy storytelling device. Now, a good filmmaker can compel viewers to identify with characters. So in the case of disease, perhaps only to lose them. Films are really good at emotional manipulation, and so it's no wonder that disease was common in terms of giving an audience member an opportunity to feel something about the characters on screen. So the first film we're going to talk about is a film called Falling Leaves from 1912. It was directed by Guy Blaché, one of the cinema's first directors. Now, I regularly teach another class at NC State called English 378, Women in Film, and we spent an entire semester talking about directors like Blaché. But today we're just going to focus on this one film. So very briefly, the plot of this film revolves around a young woman, Winifred, who has consumption, or TB, and her family consults the family doctor, who tells them that she will not live past the end of fall, and when the last leaf falls from the tree, that she will die. Her younger sister, who's very adorable, named Trixie, overhears this, and she tries to save her sister in this poetic gesture by going out and tying leaves to the trees so that the last leaf never falls. Well, while she's out doing that, she meets a doctor, Dr. Headley, who happens to have come up with a cure for consumption. And of course, he obliges young, adorable Trixie and comes to the house and treats Winifred. And it's clear at the end of the film that they've fallen in love, and probably if there was a sequel to this, they would get married. Now, this is a lovely, well-told story film, but it is not a film made with the aim of responsible science communication. Now, I presume you're all very well versed at this point in time in the way diseases can spread by air. And if I showed you this movie and asked you to watch it from a public health perspective, what would you say about it? You might say that it had a casual, possibly irresponsible, and perhaps dangerous approach to representing someone with a communicable disease. Like COVID, TB spread through the air, and so when you see especially young Trixie in such close proximity to her sister, especially when she's coughing, you would probably think, that seems a little risky. And it was, even though you may notice in that scene that the window opens and so at least there's fresh air coming in, it would still have made Trixie susceptible to the disease. The second thing you might say is, I thought you said there was no cure for consumption until the 1940s, and that is true. So this unspecified serum that Dr. Headley comes up with does not exist. There is no cure for consumption at this point in time. Now, we can look at this film now and maybe say those things, but actually they were being said at the time it was made and released as well. Most states had their own censorship boards at this period in time, and they would literally look at prints of films coming in and make decisions about whether they were shown or not, whether they needed to be cut or not. And the New York Board of Censorship, where there were a lot of people living in tenements at the time, in close conditions, was very displeased by the film. And they said, look, this is a tubercular patient who is not quarantined. Winifred is ill enough that she should have been in a sanatorium. This is completely bad modeling of behavior. And keep in mind that this is in a large and airy home, not in a crowded tenement, where this would have had real consequences. Second, they were upset that they gave the false impression that there was a cure. Now, they did have a suggestion. They said, hey, what if you changed the ending to show that Winifred had heart disease instead of TB and it was all a misunderstanding? Well, Guy Blaché did not make that change, but still, the point is well taken that there were concerns about the representation of disease and public health even in the 19-teens. Now, we are in no position to gauge any adverse public health outcomes that might have resulted from this medically inadvisable representation. And so this raises a question. Is it fair to judge a film like this for the way it represents medical science? This was entertainment, after all, not an educational film. It was not trying to be a public health film. And in fact, audiences of the time seem not to have viewed it as a film communicating important TB information. One newspaper description, for example, described it as a touching narrative of sisterly devotion. But do films have a responsibility when it comes to representing things like health, even if they are just intending to be entertainment films? And I think a great example of this, just as a kind of side note, is the way smoking used to be represented in films. If you look at films from the 1940s, everybody is smoking. And when there was a concerted effort, especially in the United States, to try to get people to stop smoking, there was a lot of pressure put on the motion picture industry to stop characters from smoking, because the idea being that actors are cool, and if they smoke, young people want to smoke. Well, there's certainly not a one-to-one correlation, but it seems pretty likely that the kind of lessening of on-screen smoking had something to do also with the decrease in smoking in this country. So that's just one example. Now I'm going to shift to film's explicitly educational potential, and I promise we will not leave entertainment entirely behind. So in the early 20th century, many people predicted that film's primary function would in fact be educational, that entertainment, documentary would go to the side. And there's a few reasons for this. Films are visual, and they're relatively easy to understand. And at a time when there was widespread illiteracy and many non-English speakers, the idea was that almost anyone could understand a message being delivered in the medium of film. People also argued film held people's attention. It was more stimulating and more engaging than textbooks or lectures. You might agree with that. Also, it was really easy to make unlimited prints of film and deliver them all over the country and show them in an array of contexts. There's kind of an inefficiency of a person delivering a lecture. You can only lecture to one group at a time. And certainly if you think about our present context and the available technology we have that allows you to participate in a class like this from the comfort of your own homes, you can understand how technology facilitates certain forms of communications. Now, in the early 1900s, one of the inventors of motion pictures, Thomas Edison, even predicted that soon textbooks would be entirely replaced by films. He was wrong about this, but still, it's a pretty interesting idea. So the reason I brought up Thomas Edison is we're going to talk about a film produced by his company next. The film is called Temple of Moloch, and it came out in 1914. Now, the primary reason for the existence of this film was educational, but like Falling Leaves, it is also a story film, so it's one of those films that's using two of those categories in its telling. Now, this was a film made in collaboration with the National Association for the Study and Prevention of Tuberculosis, and it was part of their Easter Seal fundraising campaign, which raised money for TB research. Incredibly successful campaign. My colleague at UCLA, Dr. Miriam Posner, has written a really interesting chapter in a book called Learning with the Lights Off about 6 of these Thomas Edison Company Red Cross Seal films that were made to help the public understand how the disease was spread, what measures could be taken to avoid spreading or contracting it, and to convince people that it was in everyone's best interest to improve conditions, and that it was not just a disease of the poor, because that was one of the prevailing mistaken stereotypes, is that tuberculosis only affected poor people, in part because they were more prevalent among poor people because of the living conditions. This is a film that is absolutely science communication. Again, not a term that they would have used when they made it in the 19-teens. But the point of public health is to encourage healthy behavior. And how do you change people's behavior? And that is exactly what this film does. So instead of a lecture, doctor standing on camera telling you what you should and shouldn't do, or instead of a classroom style film, this was a story film with characters and a pretty good plot. And in short, the plot is about a wealthy industrialist named Pratt. And he has a pottery factory that was, as the film tells us, badly ventilated and dusty. And in it, he has laborers, including Swanson, who we see in the film coughing. You know what that means, right? There is a doctor who comes around checking on the workers at the factory and at home and giving them medical advice and also advising Pratt as to what he should and shouldn't do. Now, this is the basic plot of the film, but what the film does essentially is to weave an educational film and scientific communication into the fabric of the fictional film. There is a scene in which the doctor comes to the Swanson family home to give them, and the audience, right, because they're watching this film, some healthful living lessons. And these are conveyed in 2 ways. One is through intertitles. Intertitles are those things that come up on the screen and communicate with language before there was sound in film. The lesson that is taught here is about coughing and the importance of covering a cough and not coughing on your family, and avoiding things like sharing drinking glasses. That's a way you could spread TB. But this is not only conveyed through language on screen. That would be inadvisable, right? Because anyone who could not read, anyone who did not know the language could not understand it. So it's also told through pantomime, which is how we might refer to these broad gestures of the hand that you see in silent film when they're trying to kind of act at a time where there was no language and you had to show, it's called compensatory acting, compensate for that lack of language. And they both pantomime in this scene, and also they dramatize the opening of the window for fresh air. Bring fresh air into this room, clean your apartment, and protect your young kids while you're doing it so that they're not inhaling the dust. And those points are made entirely through pantomime. What I find interesting is that as soon as the doctor leaves, the family immediately closes the window. Now, we don't know why. It's probably because it was winter and there was no heat, right? And so you close the window to keep your family warm. But the point is that after the doctor leaves and they close the window, what happens next? Their child dies. So there are immediate on-screen consequences of an innocent victim, right? This is that power to convey through emotions. I find this to be pretty effective science communication in the form of a fictional narrative, right? So one of the challenges is that germs, viruses, and bacteria and their spread are totally invisible. And Temple of Moloch doesn't show us the bacteria. There are films that do that through microscopic filming. But instead it uses characters and story to show us contagion and the consequences. Basically, if you do this, you will transmit the disease, and here are some ways to avoid it. But the film also does something else that's interesting because it indicts the upper class disregard for the health of the lower working classes. And there's an argument in the film about the responsibility of the wealthy for the conditions of the working poor. So in a secondary plot line, Pratt, the owner of the pottery factory, basically repeatedly ignores the doctor's advice about the need for better factory conditions and to fund open-air schools where there would be plenty of ventilation so the students didn't get sick. Now, Pratt doesn't care. He doesn't listen to the doctor. So what does the doctor do? Something pretty clever. He uses the media. He goes to the newspaper and he tells the story, thereby humiliating Pratt and upsetting his daughter. Now, that's not what changes Pratt's mind. What changes Pratt's mind about the way he treats his workers is that his daughter and his son get TB. And we later learn how in the film, which is that Swanson, the worker, has had a daughter who tended to the Pratt children and exposed them to tuberculosis. And so all of a sudden you have this sense that how you treat your workers who come into your home has consequences for your family. It may be a very self-interested motivation for cleaning things up, but the bottom line is that things get better, and the film gives us a happy ending in which Pratt is committed to clean up factories, where he writes a check to fund visiting nurses in an open-air school, and also, perhaps not surprisingly, there's a romantic ending as well, as Pratt's daughter and the doctor seem to be a couple at the final Christmas scene. So Temple of Moloch really had two primary functions. The first was to educate and improve the health of the viewing public. So anyone who came to this movie would learn something about the way that they should be if they're coughing, about not sharing drinking glasses, about fresh air, and so on. And the second was to motivate the upper classes to improve conditions to decrease the spread of disease. And it found a way to do this, not by delivering a lecture, but by telling a story. Now, there was a really palpable benefit to this strategy. Because of this, the film got to be shown and seen in an array of contexts. So, for example, in Dunkirk, New York, it was part of a program of regular entertainment films. You can see in this advertisement where it is playing alongside The Dummy Husband, which no doubt was a comedy, and The Girl and the Explorer. If you went to see this film based on this advertisement, you would have no idea that you were going to take away a lesson about tuberculosis. In Binghamton, New York, it was shown as part of a campaign for a new tuberculosis hospital. This advertisement reads, "The picture, although depicting a forceful lesson in the prevention and care of tuberculosis, carries with it a heart interest story and a clever love plot." In other words, it saw exactly what it was doing and admired both of those qualities. And finally, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, it was advertised as being shown in a program put on by the Open Air School Committee, who called it a health film with dramatic action and educational value. And there's no doubt that in the latter two contexts, audience members would have been asked to open their pocketbooks after the screenings to make a donation towards this cause of building schools and better living conditions. Now, the next time we meet, we'll be moving into the contemporary age and continuing the conversation about film's multimodal approach to representing infectious disease.